This is National Educational Television, a program distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center.
The Religions of Man with Dr. Huston Smith.
For the past 2 weeks, we have focused our attention on the founder of Buddhism. We sketched his life, we noted the problem that he faced, his approach to this problem, and the hard core of the answers he came out with, the middle way, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path. Tonight, in our concluding session on Buddhism, we turn to Buddhist history. We aren't fundamentally interested in history as such in this course, facts, dates, figures, but there are some things in Buddhist history which do interest us for the insight they provide into man and his religious outreach, what it is that works in the realm of the spirit and what does not work. It is in this spirit, then, that we turn this evening to look at some of the main features in the historical development of Buddhism. And when we turn to Buddhist history in this spirit, the thing which hits us in the face right away is that Buddhism splits. Religion, it would seem, religions are always splitting. The Jews in the first century divided as to whether to be followers of Christ or not. The Christian church divides into the Eastern Orthodox branch and the Western branch. The Western church, for its part, divides into Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and Protestantism keeps on dividing. If we turn to Islam, usually called Mohammedanism, we find there, too, very early, a basic split coming between the Sunnis and the Shias, as we shall be seeing on a later program. Well, the same thing happens in Buddhism. Before a century has passed after the founder's death, Buddhism has begun to split. The seeds of schism have been shown and are already germinating. Now, the interesting thing is why this split occurs. Why did the Buddhists divide? And the answer is that they divided over questions over which people have always divided. How many questions are there that really divide men, such that no matter where you ask them, whether you ask them in India or Lapland or Canada, no matter when you ask them, whether you ask them in the 4th century BC or in the 20th century AD, wherever you ask them, you find people taking sides, opposite sides, on these questions. Well, how many are there? Not a great many, I would imagine, but there are a few. And I want to suggest 3 to you right now. Incidentally, after this program, it might be interesting for those of you who are listening together in a living room to ask these questions to yourselves and see if you come out with agreement or disagreement. My guess would be that if we could have the totals, we would find far more split living rooms on these questions than united ones, which is simply another way of saying that if you had been Buddhists back in the 4th century BC, the same split would very likely have occurred, and we would have 2 branches of Buddhism to talk about this evening. But now, what are these basic questions, these three that we're going to look at? One of them is the question of whether man is independent or related. There are some people who have a very strong sense of their individuality. They feel that every man makes his own life, and if he gets anywhere with his life, it will be by virtue of his own hard work and doing. I heard someone just last week saying, I was born in the slums. I didn't know my mother. She died before I came of age to know her. My father was a drunkard. My brothers and sisters, they all went to the dogs. I was the only one that came through. Don't tell me, she continued, don't tell me it was environment. I grew up in the slums. Don't tell me it was heredity. I came from a family of drunkards. No, every person comes through. By virtue of their own action, man is essentially independent. And then on the other hand, you find on the other side of the fence people who say, well, yes, but not basically. True, we're divided from one another by a few feet of space, but this isn't the important thing. The icebergs in the Arctic, too, are separated by stretches of sea. But we're told that underneath the sea, these icebergs are in the main related in a common, attached to a common ice flow. So with human beings. So to the eye we're separately. Basically the words of Paul were true. We are members one of another. To such an extent that if I were to do damage to you, actually it would be as though I were doing damage to a member of my own body. Of course, the classic expression of this view, one of the most beautiful, is John Donne's sonnet, "No man is an island unto himself," and ending, of course, with those beautiful words, when the funeral bell is tolling, "Send not to ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." Well, here is one question on which people split. Now, there's another one, and this applies to mankind as a whole. Does mankind as a whole stand alone in the universe? Is he involved in a universe which is basically neutral to him? Some say yes, some say no. For those who say that he is on his own, they say that life developed out of a chance collocation of material particles. It had an incredibly long time, billions of years, to do this. Mankind has come into being by accident, and whether he advances from this point on now depends on his own will, on his own reason, his intelligence, and self-effort. Man essentially stands alone in the universe. Others say, no, we didn't come into being by accident. There are forces of support which have brought us into being and will help us in our advance in the future if only we make ourselves open to these inflooding ties of encouragement. Man has an unpayable indebtedness to the universe. The religious concept for this view is that progress is not by self-effort alone, it is also by grace. Now, let me just show you how people divide on this. A few years back, Julian Huxley came out with a book. Here's the title, Man Stands Alone. Basically, this view. And the book hadn't been out hardly any time at all when another book appeared. And what was the title of that? Well, you could predict it before it appeared. This thesis was answered by the alternative thesis. Man does not stand alone. Another one of the basic questions that people disagree about. Now, third, finally, we can ask the question, what is the best part of man? And always, whatever group you're in, you'll find some that hold out for the head and some that hold out for the heart. There was a question that used to be posed, would you rather be respected or loved? We'd hope we wouldn't have to have the choice, but suppose you had to take one or the other. Which would you take? Basically, it's the same division in outlook. Well, some people, the highest faculty in man is wisdom. For others, the highest faculty is love or compassion, the highest outreach of feeling. Now, here we have, in the answer, the opposing answer to these three questions, the heart of the difference between the two branches of Buddhism. Well, positions always get names attached to them very soon, and these did too. So let's turn now to the names of these two great schools of Buddhism. This school named itself first, and they chose the nicest name. They call themselves Mahayana. M-A-H-A. Let me stop right there, because these words tend to look strange, but actually they're not as strange as they seem. Maha, where have you heard that? Gandhi, what was he called? Mahatma. And what did that mean? The great soul. This is a word for great or large. And then the last half of the word, Y-A-N-A. Yana. Yana means a raft, a barge, a vehicle of transport, something which takes you across the seas of life to where you want to go. And so Mahayana means the great vehicle, or we might say the great raft. Well, once the Mahayanists had preempted that word, there was nothing left for the Hinayanists. They were called as a nickname to start with Hinayana. H-I-N-A, and that means little. And then again, Y-A-N-A. Hinayana, the little raft, and Mahayana, the great raft. Now, let me just add two more points of difference between them, and we'll have the two schools clearly outlined before us. The Hinayana group tended to keep Buddhism as a religion for monks. They stressed the difficulty of the way. After all, if you're thrown on your own reason and your own effort, the problems of life are difficult, and if you're completely on your own, it amounts to pretty much a full-time job. And that's the way they saw it. A religion for monks who were giving their full time to it. So let's put full time on this side. The Mahayanists made more concession to the layman, the man who was involved with a family, with a business, who was interested in religion but couldn't give his full time to it. They said, that's all right. Religion is for you too. And they welcomed the layman and translated religion over into terms which the layman could follow while pursuing his other duties. So here we put part-time. And then finally, one last difference. What is the ideal type? The highest type which deserves our imitation. And the Hinayana said the highest type is the Arhat, A-R-H-A-T. The Arhat is a man who is aiming for his own spiritual enlightenment and steadfastly devoting all his efforts to attaining it. But he's on his own. As they say, he wanders lone as a rhinoceros. The other type, however, attaching to the idea of relatedness, held up the ideal of the Bodhisattva, B-O-D-H-I-S-A-T-V-A. The bodhisattva is the person who comes right to the point of enlightenment, but voluntarily then turns his back on enlightenment to come back and spend his days, his years, the ages even, in helping other people, refusing to enter into enlightenment until he can take all others with him. The ideal of the bodhisattva is brought out in the story of the four wayfarers going across the desert. They come to a strange enclosure with high walls, and they hear sounds of great joy within. They wonder what's behind the walls. There happens to be a ladder going up. One of the four climbs up. The moment he looks over, he gives a shriek of joy and jumps over, leaving the other three just as much in the dark as ever as to what's inside. So they send up a second, the same thing happens. The third, the same thing happens. But when the fourth climbs the ladder and sees the joys within the compound, rather than jumping over himself, he comes back down the line, a ladder, and goes back across the desert to his fellow men to tell them of this destination which they can all come to. This is the ideal of the bodhisattva. And it becomes really the dominant factor in the imagination, the religious imagination of the Mahayana Buddhists. The bodhisattva is depicted in many forms, many ways. Here is a Chinese representation, Kuan Yin, very, very beautiful, seated in the posture of royal ease, with the hand outstretched in benediction, the face, the whole body serene and composed, with a slight hint of a smile on the lips. Here then is the great divide between the two branches of Buddhism. Hinayana, the little raft, Mahayana, the big raft. What happens? And the answer is that Mahayana wins. Mahayana, not completely, there's still lots of Hinayanists around, but proportionately, Mahayana makes by far the greatest gains. Why? Well, partly, I suppose, because of the appeal of compassion, the appeal of grace. But there is also another factor, a historical factor, and that is that very early in the game, Mahayana received the support of a king. It converted a king, and that always helps. It helps particularly if it converts the king who is the greatest king the country has ever known, as in this case turned out to be so. The man's name was Asoka. We don't study of him in the West, but we ought to. He is one of the most impressive figures in the history of royalty. In ancient India, Asoka stands out like some Himalayan peak, clear against the sky. He was one of the greatest humanitarians of all times. No monarch has done more for his people than Asoka did for his, in order to bring to them the karuna, the compassion, which the great raft, the Mahayana, taught. We don't have time this evening to go into the projects, the social service projects which he accomplished. He interests us particularly because it was due to him that Buddhism moves beyond India. Asoka took Buddhism as an Indian sect, and he turned it into a world religion. He was not only one of the greatest missionaries of all time, he was the first man in history who thought of the idea of world missions. All men, he said, are my children. Well, with this emphasis, the missionary aspect of Buddhism gets underway. At first it pushed west as far as Egypt and up to Syria, but later on, following Asoka's life, it pushes mainly east, like a wall, and virtually blankets all of East Asia. In the end, the Hinayana takes over the southern part, and if we were to draw our outlines, we would include Burma, Siam, Indochina, and then down to Malaya and Sumatra and Java and over into Ceylon as the territory of Hinayana Buddhism, Mahayana for its part, Nepal, Tibet, China, Japan, Korea, Manchuria, Mongolia. This becomes the basic area of Mahayana. In India, strange to tell, in India, Buddhism dies out, or more accurately, it becomes absorbed back into the Hinduism from which it emerged. Now, as Buddhism went east, the Mahayana movement, which covers by far the greatest territory, it split into a number of sects. Some of these emphasized learning, meticulous study of the texts. Some of these emphasized faith. Some of them emphasized intuition. We won't have time to go into these, but I do want to spend the rest of our moments this evening on one phase of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. We note this partly because it's one of the great living religions of Japan today, and this is the only time in our series we'll have a chance to mention Japan explicitly. But for another reason, Zen is felt by most to be the purest form of Buddhism in the East today, and some would say the purest form of spirituality, but that turns out to be a personal opinion. In any event, it has exercised, particularly in recent years, a peculiar fascination for the West. It is light, urbane, sophisticated, strange. We'll be trying to enter into some of these factors a little bit in the moments that are left. But first, what does Zen Buddhism try to achieve? It belongs to the intuitive sects of Buddhism, and that means that it scorns reason. Religion for it is a matter of experience, of basic intuitive experience. And words cannot capture this experience. Words, they say, are like fingers pointing to the moon, and is as far distant from the real thing as the finger is from the moon to which it points. Reasoning? No. Reasoning imprisons the mind. Now here's where Zen Buddhism is as far removed from the West as anything could be, because we lay our stress on reason and logic. We pride ourselves on our ability to think things through. But for the Zen Buddhist, reason is a prison house, not one bit better than that. It confines us and holds us in rather than leading us on to the truth. It follows then that one of the tasks of the Zen Buddhist is to break through this prison of the rational intellect. And the way it goes about doing this is really to sort of poke fun at the reason. It wants to sweep the mind free of its confidence in reason as taking us through to the ultimate insight. And in order to do this, it adopts a device known as the koan, K-O-A-N, which is really a kind of paradox. It doesn't make any sense at all rationally. The closest thing I think we have to it perhaps is the shaggy dog story in the West. Maybe some of you will recall the shaggy dog stories that were going around, they go around from time to time. The koan is a shaggy dog story with the humor taken out of it. That's about the best way I can say it. Let me give you an example. This is the sound of the clapping of two hands. What is the sound of the clapping of one? Now, don't tell me that one hand can't clap. If you say that, it indicates you haven't advanced very far and you can go back to the end of the class. Let me suggest another one. Wen Tzu, one of the leading Zen masters, said, let me take an illustration from a fable. A cow goes through a window. The horns, the body, the legs pass through easily. Only the tail cannot pass through. Why can't it? Well, you say that's not rational. But the point is that that's just the point. What Zen is trying to do is to poke fun at the intellect, to baffle, to excite, to exhaust the mind, to build up a kind of pressure of the intellect until, in the end, through the paradoxes, the whole rational structure collapses, and then in that moment, they look for the flash of insight, which is something like catching the point of a joke which you haven't gotten before, when suddenly you see it and the illumination comes through. What have you got when you get there? Well, you have to be very cautious here. They say Zen never tells, it only hints, because the words must not be confused with the thing. So from our point of view, it only teases, it tantalizes. But these things I think we can say. Zen is close to everyday experience. You must find it not in withdrawal from the world, but rather in involvement. You must see this world in its divine ordinariness, everything much the same and yet transformed into something different. The ego, too, must be broken through, and in the end you come to a total acceptance of life. I wish there were more time, but this brings us to our close in our brief survey of Buddhism. We began in India. We have ended in Japan. We began 2,500 years ago with one man who woke up under a bo tree. We break off tonight with 500 million men and women riding the big raft and the little raft towards salvation. What do they find in Buddhism? For those who ride the little raft, Buddhism is basically a rousing challenge to self-reliance. Ever in their ears they hear the words of the Arhat. Work out your own salvation with diligence. But for the vastly greater multitudes who ride the big raft, the appeal is very different. For them, the appeal is symbolized in the Bodhisattva, the savior who voluntarily renounces enlightenment in order to return and help others to attain it, who vows never to enter into nirvana until the grass itself has become enlightened. The vow of such a person was described in the 7th century A.D. by an Indian poet as follows. May I quench with rains of food and drink the anguish of hunger and thirst. May I be in the famine at the age's end, their food and their drink. I would be a protector of the unprotected, a guide to the wayfarers, a ship, a dike, a bridge for those who seek the further shore, a lamp for those who need a lamp, a bed for those who need a bed. I would be a soother of all the sorrows of the world. Is it to be wondered, then, that Buddhism has been called a religion of infinite compassion?
Religions of Man is produced by Washington University and KETC Channel 9, the St. Louis Educational Television Station and Production Center.
The preceding program was distributed by the Educational Television and Radio Center. This is National Educational Television.